For the acquiring movement skills section of ASPE, we look at forms of guidance. Now, the specification says that we need to be able to describe the types of guidance in different phases of learning to improve performance. So obviously we will establish what guidance is and what the different types are, and we will look at how each type of guidance is appropriate perhaps to a different phase of learning, which we've learnt about already. Also, you need to be able to critically evaluate these different types of guidance, so look at the advantages and disadvantages of them, or where they're best suited, particularly in terms of the phases of learning. And you can see in the red here we have 4 different kinds: visual, verbal, manual and mechanical. So what is guidance then? Simply speaking, it's any information that you can give a learner to help them limit the mistakes and carry out the correct techniques effectively. So anything you can give a learner to help them to learn a new skill or develop a skill and avoid making mistakes. And actually I'd probably add in there to do that safely. So guidance can be very much to do with increasing safety during skills. As we know from our previous video, there are 3 phases of learning. The cognitive phase of learning is the first one, which is very much your beginners or your novice performers. And these guys need to create a mental image in their head in order to grasp what they're trying to achieve. That's important because that's an indication as to which type of guidance is best suited to them. So bear that in mind. We've then got our associative learners, our intermediates, those that are making less errors and need to refine their skill and move onwards. And then we've got our advanced autonomous learners who have pretty much perfected the performance of the skill and might be developing tactical awareness or very much fine-tuning elements of their skill, but they, succeed most of the time. So the first type of guidance we're going to look at is visual guidance. And in terms of a description of what this is, this would be an example, or the example might be demonstrations, or showing a performer a video or pictures, or even the use of cones and lines in your performance area to guide the learner as to what to do or where to go. So obviously by the title, it's something that the learner can see to guide them to perform the skill or learn a drill or learn a technique and improve. The good thing about this is if you see something, it's much easier in some ways to get a mental picture. So again, remember who we said, which type of learner we said was very much about trying to create a mental picture. And so visual guidance can be particularly powerful for them. We'll revisit that in a minute. Seeing something done can also increase your understanding, which is obviously an advantage. However, a disadvantage might be if the demonstration is a poor demonstration or incorrect, then the learner will see that and have that as a mental image and possibly might learn the wrong technique. Secondly then, verbal guidance. So clearly this is instructions or talking through a skill or a drill or a tactic with your learners, or maybe even advising them. You could argue that verbal guidance might be things like praise or criticism as well, some kind of reinforcement, but the mark schemes tend to use these phrases, so instructions or talking through. And the good thing about verbal guidance is you can build on knowledge, so perhaps building on some kind of visual information they've already had, and you might then indicate what specifically you want the learner to look at. So by a verbal instruction, you can tell them, say, look at this part of my skill. So you can guide them much more specifically. It also might help them understand tactics. However, if you're talking too much information, can basically overload a learner, particularly early on in their learning or their experience, and if you use the wrong kind of language or it's too technical. So that might be a downside of verbal guidance. Obviously, if you're much more advanced, that might be less of an issue. Thirdly, then, we have manual guidance. Now, these last 2 types of guidance can get a little bit confused. So what's really important is we understand that manual guidance is the coach physically supporting the learner. So holding them or moving them through a skill or through an action in order to create the correct skill action. So manual guidance is the coach physically moving or physically supporting a learner, and that could be, for example, a gymnastics coach supporting a learner as they're learning a crab arch. The advantage of this is, in many cases, you can give the learner confidence. If you're helping them, a tennis coach may be guiding a tennis player through a certain swing action. You might help them get the correct kinesthesis or the correct feel for the shot. And again, trampoline or gymnastics are nice examples where, for particularly dangerous or complicated actions, that can provide security for the learner, so it can create a safety. However, too much manual guidance, so if you support them all the time and they begin to rely on you, that can maybe detract from the kinesthesis. If you use it too much and too often, the performer will become really reliant on you helping them through the action, and they obviously aren't then learning what they need to do to achieve the skill on their own. So finally, mechanical guidance. Now this is a little bit different from manual guidance. Manual guidance was the coach moving or supporting the performer directly. Mechanical guidance isn't just mechanical machinery in that sense, but it is the use of equipment or apparatus or aids to support the learning or the safe practice of a skill. This could be, for example, buoyancy aids in swimming, or it could, if you used a float to focus on your leg kick, so your hands were holding the float in swimming, that would be an example of an aid, and that would be mechanical guidance. Or it could be a ball machine in tennis, feeding the player the ball to repeatedly practice. So this use of mechanical guidance can give the performer confidence, can allow them to practice complicated skills. Perhaps we would look at a harness in trampolining. If you wanted somebody to practice a somersault, you can either use a towel, the coach can hold a towel around their waist, or you have the formal harnesses, and that allows them to go through the whole action with the security of that structure supporting them, and get the kinesthetic sense, the feel of the action. So obviously, again, it helps with dangerous or complex activities. And similarly to manual guidance, too much of this support will perhaps create an over-reliance on the performer. So there are pros and cons to each of these types of guidance. And what we're just going to finish off by doing is looking at each stage of learning and look at the examples for each of the 4 types of guidance. So a cognitive learner, they really, really rely on, and I've put it a slightly different colour because visual guidance for a cognitive learner is absolutely important. Visual guidance can be given to any type of performer, but particularly for the beginner, they need to see the image of it to get that mental picture. Verbal guidance to a cognitive learner would be very simple and basic. You don't want to give too much, and you'd be offering them a lot of feedback because they can't correct themselves. So you need to verbally guide them in terms of which subroutines are correct, which subroutines need fine-tuning, help them correct their own errors. Manual guidance, again, really important to give that beginner confidence and security and get the feel for the performance. And again, mechanical aids can always be of benefit to a beginner. So the associative learner, this practice phase, this intermediate performer, the visual guidance you might give might be more complicated, so it might be a more difficult demonstration, or you might use teaching aids, so images to just remind them of the sorts of performance they might need to do. Verbally, you might refine their skills or introduce some tactics, so increasing the challenge. Again, manually, maybe support them doing more complicated and advanced skills. So it's still important if they're learning something more challenging to them. And similarly for this, given that the performer might be in a practice phase, you can think of a tennis player and having the ball machine just so that they repeatedly practice the skills and reduce the errors and groove and overlearn that skill. Finally then, the advanced autonomous learner, the learner who knows what they're doing, can do it quite automatically. So visually, You might show them elite performers, you might analyse their performance using video analysis, or demonstrate a much more complicated skill. Verbal guidance is often more appropriate for the autonomous learner, so you can give them advanced tactics, you can talk to them technically, you can give them constructive but perhaps challenging feedback. Manual guidance then perhaps at this stage should be reducing the use of this, because this performer can perform the skills relatively successfully anyway, so it might be quite limited use. And then again, mechanically, if you use advanced equipment, even the ball machine, you might increase the range of angles that the ball might come out at to really challenge this advanced performer. Or the speed in which the ball comes out, so that you're challenging and stretching them. So there we have gone through the 4 different types of guidance, and we've looked at the advantages and disadvantages of them, and we've also looked at which type of guidance might be more suited to different stages of learning. Of course, every form of guidance might be used at each stage, so it's not kind of one or the other, but you need to perhaps be aware of which ones might be more suited to each stage of learning.